Luffy cannot win. Not after these 5 men monsters have arrived to Egghead Island to combine their geriatric powers in order to form the ultimate super being. So everything I've said in the past about Egghead Island feeling like we could win, it's now irrelevant because the 5 elders are simply overwhelming. And we are not in a good position to be taking them on. But starting with the cover story, it looks like it's going to be Yamato focused, which while I would have preferred the Tobiropo is also good. And I would assume that Yamato is going to retrace the steps of Kozuki and travel all around Wano like he did, and I wonder if Yamato might even gather some vassals in the same way that Oden did. If Yamato does the path properly, then Yamato might even end up becoming a daimyo, because I'm pretty sure we have some openings for those positions, as the previous daimyo were all killed by Kaido. The thing is, Oden eventually got bored and then set out to sea. So what we might be watching here is Yamato's journey to finally make that step towards leaving Wano. Or not, I don't know. In fact, I refuse to predict anything Yamato related anymore. But what I'm really hoping is that this cover story gives me a bit of what I felt was lacking from the Wano arc, or the ending of the Wano arc post-raid, which concluded very rapidly. And I'm really quite keen to see a peaceful rebuilding of Wano. But what we have happening in the actual chapter is the exact opposite of peaceful building. It's actually very unpeaceful destruction that gives us a full reveal of the 5 Elder Stars, along with the assorted creatures it is that they are. I say creatures because I'm fairly certain that not all of them are yokai. Saint Saturn definitely is though. As expected, this old man is a Gyuki or an Ushi Oni, but it's nice to have that confirmed with Oda's text words. And speaking of text words, this is something that might have gone over a lot of heads, but it's interesting to note how the 5 elders were introduced, because we got a collage of them in their yokai forms with your typical Oda introduction box. However, within that typical box was non-typical text. Each of the 5 elders were flat out introduced as their respective demon monster, which adds quite a lot of weight to the idea that this may not be a devil fruit ability. These old men could just be demons, because the standard way to handle a situation like this would be to say Saint Topman Walkuri, user of the Akuma no Mi model Big Pig, but instead it's just meet Hoki, as if we're actually meeting a Hoki, whatever that is. Before we get to Big Pig, Saint Marcus Mars is an Itsumade, which I believe is a yokai, and when we first saw his silhouette during the Reverie flashback, I said that this was the one that most resembles a Pokemon, and seeing it in all of its unsilhouetted full glory doesn't change my mind a single bit. It looks like an Archeops wearing an old man wig, but it's a very curious creature because its name Itsumade literally means until when. And that name, look, it requires a bit of explanation, but rest assured, it is morbid. What they're said to do is survive purely off a diet of the lamentation of the dead. So what they do is they fly over all sorts of environments like battlefields, and in keeping with the Pokemon theme, all these creatures do is say their names, Itsumade, or more accurately, Itsumademo. But what they're doing is essentially asking everyone, until when? How long will your suffering go unnoticed? Until when will this suffering go unnoticed? And they're doing this repeatedly. Until when? Until when? Until when? Until when? So they are taunting their prey to make them suffer more, because the Itsumade don't feed off the people themselves. They feed off their sorrow and their grief and all of the other bad feelings. And this integrates horrifyingly well with Marcus's role within the 5 elders, because he's the warrior god of the environment and therefore in charge of overseeing the land, and what he very much does is feed off the suffering of those within the lands. Perhaps not literally like his yokai inspiration, but he directly profits from keeping a lot of the world in misery. And if he did have a stronger connection to an actual Itsumade, then Luffy is his natural enemy, because Luffy's innate power is to make people laugh and fill them with a sort of joy. So if Luffy's around, then St. Marcus Mars has no choice but to starve because there is no grief in sight. And in this chapter, Marcus represents probably the greatest danger though, because he flew himself smack bang into the Labophase defense system. And as a result of that, there was a big explosion. But something tells me that Marcus doesn't particularly care. After seeing how Saint Saturn can regenerate, I don't think this is going to be an issue. For him, that is. It's going to be a pretty big issue for us, because without Luffy, these guys are pretty deadly. I'd also be remiss not to mention that if this is a Devil Fruit, then St. Marcus Mars is like the billionth flying Devil Fruit user, which I will bring up at each and every opportunity, because a bird man on Alabasta once told me there are only 5 Devil Fruits that grant flight, and I dare say that Oda has since come to regret that line. So Saturn and Mars are the 2 elders that directly represent yokai. The others, they get a bit more tricky, because I'm not the greatest authority on yokai, but I'm fairly certain that Saint Topman Walkuri is actually based on a creature from Chinese mythology known as Fengji, which is actually spelt the same way in Chinese characters as the Japanese kanji, although the kanji reads as Hoki. He's probably my favorite overall design of the elders in their monster forms. I just have an affinity for big chonksome creatures, which is a shame because I think he's the only one who does absolutely nothing in this chapter. Him and Saint Saturn, I I guess, but Saturn doing nothing, that's not anything new. I would like to say that most of the elders have put Saturn to shame with how immediately they sprang into action, and I'm really glad that they're finally taking things seriously. I feel like Saturn, up until very recently, has been under the impression that he doesn't even need to try. He's too powerful, too divine, and too other words as well. And whilst that's made it very satisfying to watch him consistently dig his own grave, I can't deny the hype of actually being able to see a few of these elders when they get serious. And before we get to Ethan, because mate Ethan is pretty damn cool, I want to touch on the stupidity that is the Vegapunks. We don't see a lot of Stella, Pythagoras, and Chakra in this chapter, but we do hear a lot of them, because their recorded conversation is playing over the events in the opening of the chapter, and it is such a fun contrast. What we're seeing here is quite possibly one of the most serious situations we've ever encountered. We've got hell on earth happening on Egghead. Terrifying, shadowy demon monsters are spawning from all sorts of bad circles. But what we're hearing while they're doing that is the Vegapunks talking about coffee, and also talking about how to kill more time. How much time have we killed? Oh, we've got 7 minutes left. And then almost taunting the 5 elders from beyond the grave by saying stuff like, well, even if they try to stop the broadcast, they couldn't do that in 7 minutes. And meanwhile, when you actually see the 5 elders, these gigantic demons, all of a sudden it starts to feel like, can we even hold them off for 7 minutes? That feels like a big ask. But what I like about this is the balance that Oda is able to strike between serious and wacky, which is one of the key strengths of One Piece. I think that most shonen manga in this sort of situation would be playing everything through a boring singular tone. If something serious is happening, then everyone's got to be serious. Then if something wacky's happening, then everyone's hitting that tone as well. It's like an entire orchestra of characters all playing the same note on the same instrument. For whatever reason, very rarely do we blend these things together, and even rarely do we blend them together this well. With the 7 minutes remaining though, we are on track to hear the truth of the world potentially in chapter 1112, which is a prediction based on how long 10 minutes took during the Dressrosa arc for Luffy to recover his haki and beat Doflamingo. Again though, all of a sudden 10 minutes is feeling like an almost impossible amount of time. Holding off a Warlord of the Sea? Sure, that's achievable. But holding off 5 all-powerful colossal demon things? Much less so. Which brings us back to good old Saint Ethan Baron v Nusjuro, who I think has the coolest design. It's not my favorite, but it's the coolest. And if I Google the kanji, it just gives me the skeletal anatomy of a horse. Again, I'm not deep enough into the world of yokai or Chinese mythology to know if there's a corresponding creature. I couldn't find one off a quick Google search, but there probably is, and if so, then hundreds of you are going to tell me in the comments anyway, so thank you in advance. However, the first thing I thought of when seeing this bad boy is Marie-Louise, which is a name I'm almost certainly butchering because it's Welsh, and I'm convinced that Welsh was designed to be impossible for anyone to pronounce, including the Welsh. And it's all just a very convoluted troll on the world where they pretend that they're pronouncing it correctly. And as horrifying as it looks, it's sort of like an undead horse Santa. Around Christmas time, this horse goes from house to house and sings songs with the inhabitants. It's quite lovely, really. There's more detailed history and a lot that I'm leaving out and or probably misremembering. But I think that some sort of undead skeleton horse creature is pretty common to any culture that has excessively used horses in their history. So it's hard to tell exactly where this one spawns from, at least for uncultured swine such as myself. The exciting thing about Ethan though is that he shows us his hybrid form when he becomes quite the demonic centaur, and while he's far from the first centaur we've seen in One Piece, he's the first one we know of that wasn't artificially created by Trafalgar Law. And the dude just goes so hard. In what seems like no time at all, he zips around the island and slashes all of the Mark III Pacifista, but with a very specific and I guess non-damaging attack designed to freeze their circuitry, which reminds me a lot of Brook using his blade Soul Solid, where he can use freezing style attacks due to being able to harness the cold of the underworld. Because using this, Brook is able to achieve a startlingly similar icy effect that we see happening with Ethan. And it certainly wouldn't be out of the question for a demon to be capable of wielding underworld powers. And if so, Ethan is on a whole different level. Because when Brook uses these style of attacks, he does still cut his opponents. But my interpretation on what Ethan did is that he was able to slash and freeze without actually leaving any physical damage. Because we see one of the Marine, I was going to say doctors, but engineer might be more accurate. In any case, we see a Marine, that guy, inspecting a Pacifista after Ethan attacked it, and it doesn't look damaged at all. If anything, it might be close to the effect that Trafalgar Law does with his awakening, where he's able to have his sword phase through defenses and directly attack the insides of elderly grandmothers. So something I didn't notice at first because I was so awestruck by the grotesque coarseness, but in his hybrid form, Ethan is wielding a black blade. And for those of us who haven't been meticulously investigating sword guards on the internet for 20 years now, ever since he was introduced, Ethan has been the suspected wielder of the Shodai Kitetsu, the final and and most powerful of the Kitetsu set of cursed blades. Zoro himself uses the Sandai Kitetsu as one of his regular sharp metal friends. And of course on Wano we saw the Nidai Kitetsu, which Luffy used briefly sort of. But seeing the Nidai Kitetsu was very important because it had the same style of guard as the Sandai Kitetsu, and Ethan's blade also has that same guard. So we might finally be seeing the king of the Kitetsu set in action here. And look, if anyone deserves to use the most cursed blade in all of the history, then a fairly literal demon is a good choice. And until now, I don't think we've ever seen him draw his blade, but it looks like it could be a proper black blade like Yoru and Shusui. Of course, it could also be Ethan injecting the sword with Haki, but I hope not. I am hoping for a fully achieved black blade. Because if someone like Ethan can't even max out a sword, then how does anybody make it happen? Moving to our final old man, Saint Shepherd Jupiter is a sandworm, which is immediately different from the other four because its name isn't written in kanji. The sandworm text is written in katakana, which if you can read katakana, more or less just looks like English, because he is a sandowamu. But he does stand out because the sandworm is the only one of the five that isn't, how shall we say, yokai passing. With the katakana name, it is almost certainly taken from Western media or mythology. And I do genuinely wonder if this might be a little bit June inspired. Not necessarily because of the films, because Oda is the kind of person who probably read the books when he was younger. In his youth, he consumed everything he could get his hands on, which is why One Piece is the rich world that we have today, because he took these little pieces from all of the stories to create his own. But as implied by his actual name, Saint Shepherd Jupiter is the warrior god of agriculture, which makes all the sense in the world, because worms are good for soil. All of the burrowing and stuff that they do loosens it, which improves the drainage and aeration. And you know, if he could only stop trying to eat people, then we might even have a net positive impact. Before we get to that though, we need to talk about Zoro versus Lucci, because this has been quite a hot topic for the more terminally online One Piece fans, and I don't know why. Zoro is my favorite One Piece character, but this is by far the least interesting thing happening on Egghead Island right now. And I love that Oda seems to have essentially ended this fight with a joke. We have Zoro and Lucci continuing to square off, but Zoro overhears Sanji calling him a burden, and then instantly delivers what appears to be a finishing blow. It's a very classic, cool looking Zoro panel, but very importantly, we can see a lot of black lightning, which means that Zoro has finally decided to use Conqueror's Haki. So I actually got a lot of very angry comments a few chapters ago from Rob Lucci defenders when I accused Zoro of not even trying, but really, how can he be putting in any real effort without first putting his bandana on? The dude was not taking this catfight seriously, and I still do think it's the ultimate insult to Lucci that Zoro never put the bandana on. Even Kaku got the bandana. Although there might still be time, this isn't a guarantee that Lucci is down. In the last panel we see of him, his eyes are whited out, which is the traditional indicator of unconsciousness, but also not always. Rob Lucci could get up again, but even if he does, now that Jinbei is here, this matchup is over. There's also some weird choreography happening here which kind of messed with my head when I was reading through it, which is always the tricky part of having a character that uses 3 swords but only has 2 hands. So what happens right is that Lucci knocks Enma out of Zoro's right hand, so he's left holding the Sandai Kitetsu with his left hand. But the way the panels are structured shows us that Zoro catches Enma and then puts Wado in his mouth, using his left hand, which means that Zoro would have had to briefly put away the Sandai Kitetsu to free up his left hand in order to use it to put Wado in his mouth. All the while, Rob Lucci was trying to viciously cat attack him. So it's just a little bit clunky, and it could be solved just by swapping the panels around. Whilst Enma's up in the air having a good spin, Zoro puts the Wado in his mouth with his right hand and then catches Enma in the air to attack. But the real shame of this event is that Zoro's attack didn't happen in the next chapter, which is 1111. And it's a shame because quadruple 1 is Zoro's number. That's the first 4 digits of his bounty, which is based on his birthday being the 11th of November or 1111. And then we get to my favorite part of the chapter, where Luffy is finally reunited with Dory and Broggy. It's so good. And it feels like exactly where they left off. After leaving Little Garden, Dory and Broggy saved Luffy from being eaten by the Island Eater, and now they're here saving him from being eaten by another stupidly large creature. And I don't think that Dory and Broggy are going to be the only giants showing up, because earlier on in the chapter we had this panel of at least 4 giants heading in Luffy's general direction, so we do have some nice incoming backup here. Honestly though, Jupiter is probably lucky that he didn't end up eating Luffy. After seeing what happened when Kaido ate Luffy, I don't know, it just seems like a bad idea. But the 3 panels right at the end of the chapter are everything. It's Luffy, Dory, and Broggy all laughing uncontrollably and having the time of their lives. It's exactly what I wanted from this combination of characters, and I really hope that Dory and Broggy are going to make it out of this okay, because whenever I see them, I also see the spirit of Galdino looming behind them, even though he's still alive. But I think back to how an agent of Baroque Works was able to subdue 2 giants, and it makes me wonder just how well they can stand up to the pinnacle of power in this world. And to find out, I'd highly recommend subscribing to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed.